Legends say Mountain Meadows is a haunted field. Locals would recount how they could hear low moans coming from the ground, cries in the wind, or the sight of a woman wandering through the sagebrush, always searching for something, her baby perhaps, or a missing bone that had been taken by the coyotes. The most common experience is a deep heaviness felt as you look across the arid terrain where around 120 people were slaughtered. The aftermath of this barbaric event still leaves people struggling with how to reconcile such a reckless waste of human life. This is True Crime of the Historical Kind. You're listening to part one of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, The Road to Murder. In the late summer of 1857, a wagon train rolled into a highland valley in southern Utah. Its travelers were dreaming of a new life in California, and they were almost there. But instead, they met a fate so brutal it still haunts the American West. The Mountain Meadows Massacre wasn't just a crime, it was a collision of fear, faith, and frontier violence that left all but 17 children dead. The attack was carried out by local Mormon militia members, dressed up as Paiute men, along with actual Paiute men who were involved as allies under their influence. This dark chapter of the American frontier was fueled by a toxic mix of paranoia, isolation, and escalating tension during a moment when Utah Territory believed a war with the United States was imminent. Regardless, how could a people who saw themselves as God's chosen murder innocent men, women, and children in cold blood? To understand that, we have to step into the rugged world of the 1850s in Utah Territory, a place of pioneers, prophets, and an us versus them mentality. Or rather, to really understand the mentality of the Latter-day Saints, we have to go even further back, to upstate New York, into the Burned-Over District, which was a hotbed of revivals and spiritual experimentation in the early 19th century America. It was here in 1830 that a young man named Joseph Smith organized what would become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith claimed divine visitations from God the Father, Jesus Christ, and later an angel named Moroni, who directed him to a buried record of ancient American prophets. From this, he produced the Book of Mormon, a new scripture that promised a restored Christianity. To his followers, Smith wasn't just a preacher, he was a modern-day prophet. He revealed commandments, organized a priesthood, and declared that God was still speaking to his people. For believers, it was a miracle. For outsiders, it sounded sacrilegious, maybe even dangerous. The church grew quickly, gathering converts from New England, Canada, and Europe. But its growth brought suspicion. With modern prophecy, communal economics, and the push to gather believers into tight-knit settlements challenged the Protestant mainstream. Conflict would follow, and it forged something deep in the Mormon identity, a siege mentality. They believed they were God's chosen people. They almost expected to be misunderstood and hunted for their faith because they had been called to endure for a higher purpose. By the late 1830s, the Latter-day Saints had built sizable communities in northwestern Missouri, most notably in a settlement that they called Far West. To church members, it was the gathering place of Zion. To many Missourians, it looked like an invasion. Tensions simmered and then cracked wide open. For one, Missouri was a slave state, and many Mormons coming from the north leaned toward abolition, though the church itself held a range of views. But it felt threatening to locals the way the Saints tended to vote as a unified bloc, which created a religious political force that made other citizens feel overrun. Tensions soon hardened into hostility, skirmishes erupted, and mobs attacked Mormon homes, and the Saints formed militias in response. The violence escalated in October of 1838 at the Hans Mill Massacre. A mob stormed the small settlement, killing 17 Mormon men and boys, some as young as 9, while families fled into the woods to hide. And no one was punished for it. Days later, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs issued the infamous extermination order, declaring that Mormons must be treated as enemies and driven from the state or killed. Under threat of annihilation, Joseph Smith surrendered and was jailed in Liberty Jail. Meanwhile, his followers were either stripped of their land, beaten, and or forced to abandon everything that they owned. By the spring of 1839, the shattered Mormon community limped east and crossed the nearly frozen Mississippi River into Illinois. They were exhausted, furious, and deeply traumatized, but still faithful. The wounds from Missouri became a defining memory within the church, proof that the world was hostile to God's people. And among its leaders, it planted a harder resolve. If another conflict came, they would fight rather than flee again. As Joseph Smith fled from Liberty Jail, church leaders were purchasing land in a small town called Commerce. Once Smith rejoined them, the settlement was renamed Nauvoo. There, Joseph Smith became more than a prophet. He was a mayor, a militia commander, and, most controversially, a candidate for the President of the United States. The Saints worked quickly to build what they hoped would be Zion, but tensions rose once again. With Smith's growing political power, the church run courts, and the never ending rumors of the secret practice of polygamy stirred outrage both inside and outside of the faith. Even former members rebelled, publishing accusations in the Nauvoo Expositor, the local newspaper. As mayor, Smith ordered the press destroyed. It was seen by his followers as silencing sedition, but by Illinois officials, it was proof of tyranny. He was arrested and taken to Carthage to await trial with his brother Hiram. But local anger didn't wait for the courts. On July 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail. Hiram was shot through the face. Joseph fired a small pistol in defense before attempting to escape and was killed as he fell from a second-story window. The Mormon prophet was dead. The mob got their vigilante justice, but to the Saints, this was martyrdom. And I'll do full episodes on the martyrdom of Joseph Smith in future episodes, so stay tuned. But, of course, the death of Joseph Smith sent shockwaves through the church. Leadership splintered and groups began to break off. It was Brigham Young who stepped in as the second prophet of the church. He was a stern, pragmatic apostle and was fiercely protective of the saints. And after Missouri's violence and now their prophet's murder, Young drew a firm conclusion. The Latter-day Saints would never be safe within the settled boundaries of the United States. Zion would have to be built farther west. And so the next chapter began. In 1874, the Latter-day Saints were again on the move, this time not from one American state to the other, but into what they hoped would be a permanent refuge beyond the reach of mobs, the U.S. government, and persecution. Brigham Young, the new living prophet of the church, had taken on the immense task of guiding his people west. They weren't just fleeing persecution, but they were also chasing prophecy, looking for the sacred homeland where the saints could live apart from the world and build the kingdom of God. The destination was a remote patch of high desert basin nestled between towering mountain ranges and a vast salt flat on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. This was land that, at the time, still belonged to Mexico and was home to several native populations. With determination and great spiritual faith, trains of wagons blazed trails across the plains and over the Rocky Mountains. Finally, on July 24, 1847, after months of trekking through the wild terrain, the first Mormon wagon company reached the Salt Lake Valley. It was dry, mostly treeless, and in their eyes, uninhabited, though it was sparsely populated by Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. But to Brigham Young, it was exactly what they needed: isolated, expansive, and far from federal oversight. Looking out over the valley, he reportedly said, "This is the right place. Drive on." Within weeks, irrigation ditches were being dug, crops were planted, and a grid of streets and lots was laid out with near military precision. It was here Mormons would earn their persona of bees, working together in the hive of Deseret. Though their settlement could be viewed as more of an experiment, it was exactly what humans can create when they have a collective goal, and their religious beliefs fueled that. It was unlike anything west of the Mississippi, but the region's isolation wouldn't last. Just a year later, the Mexican American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Salt Lake Valley suddenly belonged to the United States, meaning the Mormons were once again subject to federal law. Still, the Saints pressed forward. Brigham Young petitioned Washington to recognize their new territory as the state of Deseret. Congress declined and instead created the Utah Territory in 1850, but they did appoint Young as its first territorial governor. The ultimate destination was set, and Mormon immigrants began to trudge across the plains in handcart companies, literally walking, holding a cart behind them. Many were converts from both America and Europe, which is the result of missionaries proselyting and promising a new life out west. They mostly came from England, Scandinavia, and beyond. Thousands of people braved hardship for a chance to join the gathering at Zion. While many were successful and crossed without incident, there were plenty of disasters and heartbreaks. Like in 1856, when the Willie and Martin handcart companies were trapped in an early winter storm in Wyoming. Around 250 immigrants died of exposure or starvation. This event was yet another searing trauma that deepened the Saints' martyr identity. And as the settlements grew with the influx of people, so did the tension. The Saints found themselves surrounded by indigenous nations who had long histories on the land. Relations were uneasy at times, but collaborative at others. Brigham Young, as a practical man, adopted a policy he called Feed Them, Don't Fight Them, encouraging trade and diplomacy. But beneath that policy was a readiness to defend Mormon claimed land and sovereignty by force if necessary. And it wasn't just native groups they were worried about. As Manifest Destiny pushed more Americans west and the gold rush sent thousands of fortune seekers through Utah on their way to California and Oregon, the Saints found themselves facing a new kind of threat. Their tight knit, religiously governed society now sat directly in the path of a nation spilling westward, and once again, they were colliding with the outside world. To Americans, Utah looked like a strange, secretive kingdom led by a man who claimed to be a prophet but seemed to rule like a king. And to the Mormons, those outsiders looked like disruptors in the peace that they were destined to establish. Needless to say, it was a volatile balance, one that wouldn't hold forever. It didn't take long for the federal government to begin sending non Mormon officials like judges, Indian agents, postmasters, etc., to administer federal law in the territory. Many of them arrived with their own suspicions about the Saints, and what they found really only confirmed their unease. Mormon Utah was, again, unlike anything in the United States. The church controlled the courts, a militia, the economy, even the mail. Land was distributed through the church, tithing was expected, and in 1852, the church officially acknowledged the practice of plural marriage, more commonly known as polygamy. It was confirming one of its worst kept secrets, and it ignited a firestorm of national outrage. Non Mormon officials quickly found themselves completely unwelcome or simply ignored. Some resigned and fled east, reporting that Utah was essentially a theocracy run independently from the United States. In turn, church leaders accused federal appointees of arrogance, bigotry, and meddling in local affairs. And Brigham Young? He stood firm. He maintained control over the territorial militia, the Nauvoo Legion, and insisted on the right to manage Native relations without federal interference. And he made it clear that while the Saints were willing to live under the U.S. flag, they would do so on their own terms. But the United States government had far bigger troubles closer to home. Sectional fractures over slavery, the violence of bleeding Kansas, and growing talk of secession dominated Washington's attention. In comparison, what was happening in Utah seemed strange, frustrating, and politically embarrassing, but still too serious to ignore. Meanwhile, as Mormon settlers pushed deeper into the valleys and plateaus of southern Utah, they were entering Paiute country. For centuries, the Paiute people had lived across the arid Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, successfully adapting to the land's scarce resources through seasonal movement and deep kinship ties. But Mormon colonization upended that rhythm. As new towns sprang up like Parowan, Cedar City, and Santa Clara, so too did fences, irrigation ditches, and grazing herds that quickly overused the land. The Mormon vision of civilization with agriculture and permanence clashed with indigenous ways of life that were rooted in mobility and stewardship of fragile desert ecosystems. Displacement came quickly. Settlers diverted water sources, claimed fertile land, and hunted wild game that tribes depended on. Because of this, along with waves of introduced diseases, the southern Paiute population collapsed. Historians estimate by as much as 90%. Entire bands were left struggling to survive in a landscape that had once sustained them. In this new reality, the Paiutes had to adapt to the growing Mormon presence. Cooperation wasn't completely born out of alliance so much as survival. The Saints offered occasional food and access to limited trade goods, all invaluable to communities facing devastation. And in return, some Paiute groups worked with or assisted Mormon settlers when it benefited them. It was a relationship based on necessity, not trust. And Brigham Young, ever the strategist, encouraged that diplomacy with indigenous tribes, so long as it served Mormon ends. There was also a sense of religious obligation. Early Latter-day Saints believed that Native people were descendants of the Lamanites, a group described in the Book of Mormon as ancient Israelites who had fallen into conflict with the Nephites. The text speaks of a mark that distinguished the groups, and 19th century church leaders often interpreted this as relating to skin color. But crucial to their worldview was the idea that Lamanites were a chosen people who could be spiritually redeemed and restored through the gospel. So, needless to say, it was a complicated, informal alliance, but it could shift in an instant. There were still livestock raids blamed on Paiutes, followed by Mormon reprisals, but a dangerous dynamic was forming, one where violence became easier and easier to justify. By the spring of 1857, federal officials stationed in the territory continued to feel like they were in a country within a country, and they were not shy about reporting their discomfort back to Washington. Those reports were filled with claims of rebellion, lawlessness, and polygamy run amok. President James Buchanan made a decision to replace Brigham Young as the territorial governor. But it didn't stop there. Knowing this would not be an easily accepted change, he ordered an army of 2,500 troops to march west to escort the new governor and ensure order in Utah, thereby reinforcing federal authority. The word of troops headed towards Utah felt like a repeat of every betrayal and assault they had ever faced. Being driven out of Missouri under threat of extermination, their prophet Joseph Smith being gunned down, the murders at Haun's Mill, their homes being burned, and their families scattered. Not to mention, a beloved Mormon apostle had been recently murdered in Arkansas. Harley P. Pratt had been one of the earliest and most influential leaders of the church. He was a close friend of Joseph Smith and a missionary whose writings helped shape early Mormon theology. In May of 1857, he was attacked and killed by the estranged husband of a woman who had converted to Mormonism, who Pratt had married as a plural wife. Though many would learn this and see the motive of the crime, news of Pratt's death landed like yet another blow in a long chain of martyrdom in the eyes of the saints. Many saw it as further proof that the United States didn't protect them, didn't understand them, and now they were armed and advancing towards them. Brigham Young had talked about the possibility of declaring martial law using the Nauvoo Legion, though that would come later on. In real time, it just shows how serious they took the threat of outsiders. Brigham Young was ordering the people to prepare, and they did. They began stockpiling supplies, stopped trading with the outsiders, and evacuated outlying settlements. What followed would be known as the Utah War, though it was more of a cold standoff. Still, the implications were enormous. In July of 1857, the tension between the federal government and the Latter-day Saints was expressed from the pulpit, and Brigham Young didn't hold back. In fiery sermons, he called for mass rebaptisms, spiritual renewal, and absolute obedience. That swept through Utah in what became known as the Mormon Reformation. The rhetoric emphasized following leadership, divine vengeance, and defending Zion at all costs. This was, of course, reiterated by regional leaders across Mormon settlements. Collectively, it created an atmosphere of fear, paranoia, and us versus them mentality. For many, the line between defensive preparation and militant fervor began to blur. In a theocratic society where church and state were intertwined, the language of the prophet and governor carried more than spiritual weight as it was digested by the people, especially in its far flung southern settlements. Here, they were dealing with scarcity, drought, poor soil conditions, and far less resources than their northern Utah counterparts. Cedar City was struggling, but still an important Mormon outpost. It's about 250 miles south from the headquarters of Salt Lake City, so more isolated. But orders still traveled along two lines, civil and church, with Brigham Young as the head. But those dual positions usually ended up being held by the same men. So a man with a higher religious calling typically had more political authority, just like a man named John D. Lee. Lee was the bishop of the Cedar City ward. A bishop is like the local religious leader, and the ward is the congregation. Lee was also an officer in the militia in the Nauvoo Legion, and acted as an Indian farmer, which is a government appointed position that acts as a liaison. So he had spent years cultivating relationships with the nearby Paiute tribes and had even adopted or fostered several Paiute children. Lee was charismatic, a deeply devoted church member who was very loyal to Brigham Young. He was even considered Young's adopted son, which at the time, this was sort of a religious link that showed commitment and loyalty. It wasn't in a literal sense. Other local Mormon leaders included Isaac Haight and William Dame. Isaac Haight was the stake president, which is a religious role that sort of oversees bishops regionally. He was also the mayor of Cedar City. That's in addition to being second in command within the Nauvoo Legion. William Dame was the commander. Dame was also a stake president, but he resided over the nearby town of Parowan. These are some of the local leaders that were a part of the sermons, whispered meetings, and this siege mentality that was intensifying in southern Utah. The idea of divine retribution, of purging the ungodly and preparing Zion for judgment, was not just spiritual rhetoric for some. It was becoming an actionable worldview. So, when a wagon train appeared on the horizon in late August, the Mormon men in southern Utah didn't see tired emigrants. They saw an approaching threat. Their very presence immediately raised suspicions. In reality, the Baker-Fancher Party, as they'd come to be known, was simply a large and well-outfitted group of emigrants from Arkansas, heading west on the Spanish Trail toward California. They numbered between 120 and 140 men, women, and children. They had crossed the plains without incident until they entered Utah territory. The wagon party could not have known. They were coming through Utah at the worst possible time. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening, and I just want to say it's been just a little over 2 months since I started the podcast, and I've started to get some of the kind messages or reviews, so thank you so much. I have so many more stories I plan on sharing, so make sure that you're following, subscribing, whatever, so you don't miss part 2 or any future episodes. Until next time, bye.